I count it a privilege to be able to speak to everyone who's joined tonight. So with a copy of the scriptures, we read together in the book of Daniel, and we read firstly from chapter 4 and verse number 17. Daniel 4 and verse number 17. And it says, "This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of man, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth over it, and setteth up over it the basis of man." And it's really the expression there in the middle of that text, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of man. Now let's turn back to chapter 1. There's a few nights of ministry ahead of us, and tonight we're going to look at Daniel chapter 1. And it's quite a short chapter. I'll abbreviate part of it, but we read from verse 1. And it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. For unto them the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse, liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse or vegetables to eat, and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenances of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat, and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse or vegetables. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Look down at verse number 21. We'll conclude our reading from the scriptures. And Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus. And the Lord bless to us this very beautiful reading of the sacred scriptures. And of course, as I'm speaking to our hearts tonight, one of the things that has come to our hands is quite a bit of time. Even Elaine was teasing me because I did have, well, I had a few things arranged, or at least I thought they were arranged this year. Some things in the calendar. I was meant to be at a conference last weekend, some other conferences coming up, some gospel meetings. And I began to wonder to myself, however I would do some of the chores around the house and the grass and the lawn care, some of the stuff like that. And Elaine was teasing me last week, and she figured by the time this is all over, I'll be cutting the grass with scissors. Well, we'll see what happens there. One of the things that we can do is, of course, we're able to study books now, like the book of Daniel. And it's a remarkable book. And it has come to our hands via the Holy Spirit. And it's inscripturated for us. And we have it in our own language. And it's a most beautiful book. One of the things that really we appreciate as we move into the book of Daniel is the literature of the book. As I'm speaking to our hearts tonight, most will know that Daniel, in this version that we have, is composed of 12 chapters. And in the literature of the book of Daniel, there's 2 sections. Chapter 1 through chapter 6. That's the first section of 6 chapters. And then as we move into the next section of the book, chapter 7 through chapter 12, there's another major section. And again, it's 6 chapters. As we look at the literature of the book, it's quite a thing that in the first section of the book, there's lots of stories. And we've got a story here, a narrative in chapter 1. And then we move into chapter 2 and the narrative of the king's dream. And then we're in chapter 3 and there's the narrative, the story of the king's image. And then we're in chapter 4 and we've got the story of the king's fall, Nebuchadnezzar's fall. Then we move into chapter 5, and in chapter 5, it's Belshazzar and the narrative of the ending of the Babylonian kingdom. And then into chapter 6, and when we're in chapter 6, we've got the den of lions. And the first section of the book is largely composed of stories and narrative. And you move into the last section of the book, and it's quite a thing that there's no stories. It takes up a very different connotation. It takes up a very different setting. And there's things disclosed to our hearts. It's stories or narrative in the first 6 chapters. And there's none of that in the last 6 chapters. And so we've got the narrative or the literature of the book of Daniel. The second thing I'll mention quickly, for sake of time here tonight, not only the literature of the book of Daniel, 2 major sections, chapters 1 through 6, chapters 7 through 12. The next thing I'll mention is the language of the book of Daniel, because the book of Daniel is a most interesting book in the sense that it's written in 2 languages. If you read from chapter 1 right into chapter 2, and you get to chapter 2, verse 4, in verse 4, the language in which the book is written changes. And we move from Hebrew, and from chapter 2, verse 4, right through to chapter 7, verse 28, it's not so much written in Hebrew, but it's written in Aramaic. And there's a reason for that. Now, I won't go into that tonight. Maybe in some of the subsequent nights and in the nights to come, we look at the difference in the language. But from chapter 1, verse 1, right through to chapter 2, verse 3, it's Hebrew. From chapter 2, verse 4 to chapter 7, verse 28, it's written in Aramaic. And then from chapter 8 through to the end of the book of Daniel, we're back to the Hebrew language. And there is a very particular reason for that. And I'll just leave that, because what we want to do is just, hopefully, some of these things will make some of our beloved brethren and sisters read the book of Daniel and think about some of these questions. Why is it from chapter 2, verse 4, that it moves into the Aramaic language? And why is that the language of that section of the book? So the literature of the book and the language of the book. The third thing that I'll mention very quickly is the location of the book. Now, in our English Bible, in the translation that we use here, Daniel is associated with 3 major prophets. And you likely are aware we've got Isaiah, and we've got Jeremiah, and then we've got Ezekiel, and then we've got Daniel. in the King James Version that I have read from tonight. Those four stand together, and of course we call them, and scholars have called them, the major prophets. Now the reason they call them the major prophets is because of the size of the book. There are other prophets, and there's a book of 12, as it's referred to, that we will find them later on in the Old Testament. And they're smaller in scope, and some of those are called minor prophets. And they're called minor prophets because their books are not just as big. Mind you, if we get to heaven and we speak to some of those people, Zechariah, I'm not so sure that when I get to heaven that I want to look at Zechariah and call him a minor prophet. But when I get to heaven and see Daniel, certainly we'll be able to speak to Daniel, and he's recognized in this translation and in the setting from which we have read as one of the major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. The interesting thing is this: if we were reading from a Hebrew Bible, Daniel is not placed with those other three books. In the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is placed almost at the end of the Hebrew Scriptures. And the book of Daniel in the Hebrew setting is side by side the book of Esther. And that's a very interesting thing, because the book of Esther tells how God preserved a woman in the kingdom of Persia. And Daniel, of course, tells us about how God preserved a man in the kingdom of Babylon into the kingdom of Medo-Persia. And so, one of the things I learned from this, beloved saints, is this: that God is still able to preserve his people. Whether it's a sister, and you think of some of our beloved sisters in the front line, some nurses, some doctors, God was able to preserve Esther in the kingdom in which she was found. And God was able to preserve Daniel in the kingdom in which he was found. And that's the location of the book of Daniel. And of course, maybe I should apply that further. God is able to preserve us. I would say tonight that many of us have certain fears. And we look around, and the world now isn't just what it was just a few weeks ago. Things have changed, even in our experience. Well, Esther was preserved in the kingdom that she was found in. Daniel was preserved in the kingdom in which he was found. So we've got the literature of Daniel, we've got the language of Daniel, we've got the location of Daniel. Maybe I'll take a moment and speak about links to the book of Daniel. Of course, many of our beloved brethren and sisters, you know that one of the major links in the New Testament to the book of Daniel is the book of Revelation. And we read some of the prophecies of Daniel, and we go over to the New Testament, and we read from Revelation, and you can see almost a perfect correlation between the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation. And there's a link there. The other beautiful link, I won't develop the Revelation one, but the other beautiful link that I will develop, and people have ministered upon this, but it's worthy of study, and that's why I mention it tonight, is comparing the book of Daniel to the writings of Peter. You know that Daniel is found in Babylon. Where was Peter when he wrote 1 Peter? You remember 1 Peter chapter 5, Peter tells us that he's in Babylon. That will give us a correlation and a comparison between the two books. You remember when Peter writes, Peter's taken up with the suffering of Christ, and he speaks about the glory after these. And you see, as Daniel's writing, Daniel takes up the suffering of Christ. Read chapter 9, and Daniel takes up the suffering of the Lord Jesus. And of course, as you're reading that chapter, don't forget, there's the glory after these. So Peter focuses on the sufferings and the glory, and Daniel focuses on the sufferings and the glory. Peter speaks about mountains. You remember in 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter focuses on the mountain and the glory of Christ. You can go through the book of Daniel, and Daniel focuses on some of the mountains. As you come to the book of Daniel, Daniel mentions Christ as the stone, chapter 2. You remember Peter, 1 Peter chapter 2, he mentions Christ as the stone. And you can go through various other links. I won't do it tonight, but there is a beautiful symmetry And there are beautiful links between the writings of Peter and the writings of Daniel. And of course, if we stayed with that, we would stray from my primary purpose tonight of looking at Daniel 4 and verse number 17 and considering that the Most High, he rules in the kingdoms of men. The thing that I'll mention just before I move from it is not just the literature and the language and the links and the location, some of those other things in the book of Daniel, learning from the book of Daniel. One of the things that we have come to the book of Daniel for tonight is so that we might learn. There are things in this book. There was a time in which Daniel lived, and there's a time that we are living in. There were things that Daniel faced, and there's things that we are facing. There were problems that Daniel had, and there's problems that we have. There were crises that Daniel experienced, and there's crises that we're experiencing. And we come to the book of Daniel, and we encourage our hearts. And the primary text that I've chosen, the Most High, he rules in the kingdoms of men. Now, with that said, we're going to move over into Daniel 1. I gave that just an elementary introduction into the book, so that we're not coming into the book of Daniel cold, but we've got a little bit of feel for the book, and we understand something of the background of the book, and we've got something of the feeling of the book, and something of the living character and the vitality of the book. And that will bring us now into Daniel chapter 1 with the background that the Most High, he rules in the kingdoms of men. Now, having said that, the first thing I mention is the situation that we're faced with in Daniel 1. Daniel and his situation. We could develop this. We could develop the fact that there were 3 incursions by the Babylonians down into the land of Israel. The Babylonians, under King Nebuchadnezzar, they raided down from Babylonia in 606 BC, in 597 BC, and in 586 BC. Those are the 3 dates that Nebuchadnezzar moved down. I'll go over them again, just in case some younger believers that are with us don't know that. 606 BC, 597 BC, and 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar came from Babylon into the land of Israel, and he raided down into the land. And those are the 3 dates that provide for us Daniel's situation. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar came down in 606 BC, he takes some of the princes. We read that here in some of the verses. In verse number 1 and in verse number 2, he brought the vessels from the house of the Lord, some of the vessels from the house of the Lord into the treasure house of his God. Verse number 6, we read, among those that were taken were sons of Judah, some of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And they're taken from their homeland, and they're removed from the land of Judah, and they're taken away to the land of Babylon. So the first thing I want to speak to you about is the situation in the chapter that Daniel found himself in. And you say, Babylon. What's the connotation that Babylon draws to our minds as we consider Babylon in the scriptures? Well, if we're thinking about Assyria in the Old Testament, it always speaks to us, or generally speaks to us, about materialism. If we're looking at Egypt in the Old Testament, it generally speaks to us, not just the world materially, but Egypt speaks to us about the world morally. Well, what about Babylon? Babylon in the scriptures is not the world materially or the world morally. Babylon in the scriptures is the word religiously. So if we keep that in mind, it will help us with a study of Babylon. Now, all of those things are not watertight compartments. Maybe you'll find sometimes Egypt has the correlation with the religious world. And maybe Assyria has some of those other correlations too. But keep in mind, generally speaking, Assyria is material, Egypt is moral, and of course, Babylon is the religious world. So Daniel is found in a world that he never experienced before. He's about maybe 800 miles, maybe 900 miles from home, in a world that was foreign to him. and in a world that was foreign to his thinking. And you say, this was quite a challenge for a man. How old was Daniel? I'll just take a moment, let you ponder that. How old was Daniel at the beginning of Daniel chapter 1? And how old was Daniel at the end of Daniel chapter 1? You will find that at the beginning of Daniel chapter 1, he's a young man. He's a teenager, actually, maybe around 16 or possibly 17 years of age. When you come to the end of Daniel chapter 1, 70 years have come and gone. And at the end of Daniel chapter 1, he's not a teenager anymore. At the end of Daniel 1, where I read there, verse number 21, Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus, the Persian. 70 years have transpired. And in verse number 21, Daniel's a man now. He's about 87 years of age. So 70 years have transpired. And here's a young teenager. Here's a young man. And he's found away from home. He's found in a strange country. He's found in a strange situation. He's found in a different country. He's found away from his friends and away from his family members. And of course, he's in the land of Babylon. Of course, you know, Babylon is the center in Scripture, not just of religion, a religion against God, but it's the center of rebellion against God. I'm thinking now of the book of Genesis chapter 10. You remember they're journeying from the east, and it says in Genesis chapter 10 that they came to the plain or the land of Shinar. And you remember in Genesis chapter 11, they start to build a tower. And of course, this translation says they built a tower, and it says here, whose top might reach into the heavens. Now, I personally don't think that they were that stupid. I personally don't think they were that silly, that they had the idea that they would build a tower that reached right into heaven itself. I don't think that's the idea. Some other translations might give us the idea whose top was a representation of the heavens. And in some way, they were on the verge of a power breakthrough. In some way, the top of that tower had a religious symbolism. And it was for religious practices. And it was the symbol of rebellion against God. Religious rebellion against God. And here's the man, Daniel, that he's back in the center of world religion. And he's back in the very place where there was rebellion against God. And of course, many who I'm speaking to know that Abraham had come from a land. If I was asking you tonight, where did God bring Abraham from? You know, of course, Abraham was brought from the land of Babylon, Ur of the Chaldees. And the very place that Abraham was brought from, now Abraham's descendants have been taken back into that land. I learned a very practical lesson. And the practical lesson I learn is this. And the thing that touches my heart, here the nation largely was in disobedience to God. And when they were in disobedience to God, God allowed them to go back into the darkness that he had called their forefathers from. You know, beloved saints, if we are disobedient to the Lord, the possibility could be that God might allow us to go back into darkness, the darkness that he called some of our forefathers from. And it's a very solemn thing. And I want it to be a searching thing and a challenging thing tonight. And yet here is this man, and the situation of the chapter. He's in Babylonia. He's away from his family. Largely speaking, he's away from his friends. He's 900 miles from home. And yet, he will learn in those situations, the Most High rules in the kingdom of man. Now, the second thing I mentioned, and I'll go quickly here, I have a few points that I would like to get to, is not just the situation of Daniel and the situation of the chapter. I want you to think with me of the society of the chapter. And you say, what was the society? The society in which Daniel lived was the society where there were many gods. We would call it pantheism. We would call it a pluralistic society. That's the society that Daniel found himself in. In fact, they had their own situation and scenario about how creation came into being. They called it the Enuma Elish, and they had the creation epic about how creation came into being. And you think of what we would call a Christian. Maybe we can't use that term about Daniel in the strict New Testament setting of the word, but we'll call him a saint. You think about an Old Testament saint, and he's found in Babylon, and pushed into his mind from he was only a child was the words of Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he heard about the Elohim that created the heavens and the earth. And now, in the society in which he's found, there are people and they tell him, that's not how creation came to be. Creation didn't come about by God creating. There was this great creation epic, Enuma Elish. And that's what Daniel faced in that society. There was the supreme triad of gods. There was Enlil, there was Anu, there was Enki. Those were three of the supreme triad of gods of Babylon. There was no morality in Babylon. Men could live whatever way they like. Worship whatever God you want. Live whatever way you want. Don't worry about serving one God. Serve many gods. And of course, you don't have to be bothered about any limitations. There's no absolutes in this Babylonian society. No absolutes at all. And you don't have to bow to the supreme will of any god, whether it's Nabu or whether it's Nebo or whether it's, what was the other name? Nego, for that one god. They also called him Baal or Lord, and yet they didn't believe that at all. Babylon was a situation and a society of many gods. You might wonder why I would mention that tonight. Well, the society that Daniel was found in is the same society that we're found in. Look around tonight. We're living, people don't believe the God of the Bible. And people don't believe the creation narrative of the sacred scriptures. And there's no morality. And there's no absolutes. And people will tell you, you believe in one God, the supreme being, the one that is supreme power, the one that reigns over all. That's the society that Daniel was found in. And beloved saints, you can see that Daniel, and the book of Daniel, is right up to date, because that's the society that we are found in. Daniel's situation and Daniel's society. And of course, the morality of Babylon, well, sexual immorality abounded. People could do whatever way they could live whatever way they wanted. They could sleep with whoever they wanted. They could live this way and live any way. And take a look around us tonight. That's just the way people live in the society that we're found in. And you can see that this book of Daniel, it presents a challenge to our hearts. The situation of the chapter and the society of the chapter. The third thing I mentioned, you'll notice the sovereignty of the chapter. One of the things that was a big problem to Daniel was the sovereignty of God. Actually, if you've got the copy of the scriptures open, look at verse number 2. Because in verse number 2 of Daniel 1, it says, and the Lord gave. Look at verse number 9. It says there in verse number 9, now God had brought. That's actually the same Hebrew expression. It's simply, now God gave Daniel into favor. Look at verse number 17. It says, as for these 4 children, God gave. Verse number 2, the Lord gave. Verse number 9, God gave. Verse number 17, God gave. In the first one, we've got punishment from the Lord. In the second one, we've got the providence of the Lord. He allowed Daniel into the tender favor of this man that's the chief over these eunuchs. And of course, in verse number 17, it's not punishment from the Lord. And it's not the providence of the Lord. It's the preservation of the Lord. You'll notice these 4 children, these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge. And God was able to protect them. And thank God that our God is still the God that's able to protect us. You think of this virus. You think of the problems. We look at the epicenters of the virus. Look at New York tonight. And we look at London, England. And we look even at our own province and where we are found. One of the things I have to say is I personally appreciate, and I know I'm speaking for Elaine and many others that I'm addressing tonight, I'm sure that you appreciate with me the measures that our government has taken. You think of Premier McNeil, and you think of Dr. Strang and how they have moved and the measures they have taken. We accept that, and we bless God for that. And you can see that there was the providence of God. Under divine providence, Daniel prospered. And you know, beloved saints, the providence of God is upon our own province tonight. And God has moved, raised up men, and allowed these men to have power and given these men wisdom. And we appreciate that. But as I say, the first reference in the chapter is the most puzzling reference. And it was a problem for Daniel. And I would say it brings this chapter right up to date for us as we are found tonight. You know, Daniel looked around and he had the problem of his situation. And he had the problem of his society. And he had the problem of looking around and seeing people live whatever way they live and worship whatever God they wanted. A pluralistic society, a pantheistic society, neo-paganism is where we are found tonight. All of these problems. Daniel had the same problem. Daniel's biggest problem wasn't the society. And Daniel's biggest problem wasn't his situation. Daniel's biggest problem was God. Verse number 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And Daniel's faced with this problem in the land of Babylonia, far from his homeland. He's faced with the problem, why did God allow this? Why did God allow it now? Why did God allow this in my life? You know, beloved saints, that's the question that many are asking tonight. Some are facing financial difficulties. They never thought that just a few weeks ago. Some are facing just the insecurity of an employment situation. They never thought that a few weeks ago. And one of the problems that Daniel faced is this. Where is God in the whole situation? What about the promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What about that message that God gave to King David, 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse number 14? Where is that now as this man Daniel is found in Babylon? I think it was a man, Eli Vessel. Eli Vessel wrote a book. The title of the book is called Night. I maybe wouldn't advise everyone reading it, but certainly mature believers, if they wanted to get a hand on that book. Elaine got a copy of it just last summer, and she listened to the audio copy of Eli Wiesel's book, Night. And he describes, he was a Jewish man. He was in some of the Nazi death camps. And in that book, Night, he describes a situation one day where they brought out 3 people and they were going to be hanged. 2 of them were men and the other one was just a little boy. And they hanged the 2 men on either side, and they raised the little boy and they hung the little boy. And they made all of those prisoners, all of those Jewish prisoners, and all of those prisoners of the death camp, they made them parade past the corpses that were hanging from the rope. And as they were doing, some of those bodies, they were still twitching. And as they're walking past, Eli Wiesel was in the line, and there was another Jewish family that was coming behind him, and there was a Jewish man back there. And that Jewish man coming behind him, Eli Wiesel could hear that man, and the man said this. He said, "Where is God? Why did God allow this? Why has God allowed these circumstances? Where is God?" You know, beloved saints, there's many, and they're facing the very same thing tonight. And we're addressing this problem. from Daniel chapter 1. Don't forget now, the Most High God, the Most High, he rules in the kingdoms of man. And we've got the situation of the chapter. And we've got the society in the chapter, the society that Daniel was found in. And we've got the sovereignty of the chapter. The Lord gave, God gave, God gave. Verse 2 and verse 9 and verse 17. And Daniel's big problem was this: where is God? And maybe in our hearts, as we consider the problems around us, we're asking the same thing. Where is the Lord in all of these situations? The fourth thing that I'll mention is not just the situation of the chapter and the society of the chapter and the sovereignty in the chapter. I was going to speak about the sanctity that is mentioned in the chapter. Maybe I'll leave this one. You will notice that in verse number 2, it says that the Lord gave Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, and he also gave part of the vessels of the house of God. They lost part. One of the things, beloved saints, you've likely done the math of the dates that I've already given you: 606 BC, 597 BC, and 586 BC, 20 years. Inside 20 years, they didn't only lose part, they lost everything. By the time 586 BC came, the very temple structure itself, it was demolished. The house of God, it was torn down. The temple was lost. The house of God was in ruins. You know, beloved saints, there's a very practical lesson here, and I just leave it. It's not really primarily what I have in my subject tonight, but I mention it just for a challenge to our hearts. We can give up part. Very soon, we give up some more. And very soon, we give up some more ground. You know, beloved saints, could I encourage our hearts just to hold ground for God? Don't give it up, because they lost it. Then they lost some more. And then they lost still further. And then they lost a little bit more until it was all gone. And the sanctity of the chapter, they lost part of the vessels of the house of God. Notice with me the students in the chapter. And this will bring us into something. I've only got about 10 minutes left here. And so I'll go over this part very quickly. The situation in the chapter, the society in the chapter, the sovereignty in the chapter, the sanctity in the chapter, the vessels of the house of God. You will notice the students in the chapter. These 4 Hebrew children, the 4 young men that attract so much of our attention and our admiration as we study the book of Daniel. Of course, we're frequently given to their Babylonian names. You will notice whenever Daniel refers to them and Daniel writes about them, whenever they're spoken of by Nebuchadnezzar and some others in the book, they always call them by their Babylonian names. Whenever Daniel writes about them, he always calls them by their Hebrew names. And of course, we have it here: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You'll notice as we consider the students in the chapter, you will notice the first thing, we look at their dwelling. I won't mention that. They have been taken from the land of Israel and away to the land of Babylon. You'll notice in the chapter that we've got their diction. If you look with me at verse number, let's see if I can get it here. He wants to change their language. I think it's there in verse number 4. The end of verse number 4 says, whom they may teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So we've got their dwelling and we've got their diction. You'll notice we've got their designation. He changed their names. Why would he change their names? Well, he doesn't want anything of the stamp of God to be left upon them. Their names had a link to the God of Israel. Daniel. El is one of the names of God. You think of Meshach and Azariah and Hananiah, and you think of these men. The ending of Hananiah is Jehovah, and the ending of Azariah is Jehovah. And the reason why Nebuchadnezzar wanted to change their names, he didn't want anything of God, the stamp of God, and the imprimatur of their God, and living for their God to be left upon these men. He put them into a 3-year university course, UNB, the University of Babylon. And the whole purpose of that university was to remove the stamp of God from their lives and the knowledge of God from their minds, so that at the end of 3 years, they would almost be as much like the Babylonians as it was possible to be. So we've got their dwelling, and we've got their diction, and we've got their designation, and of course, the last thing in the chapter, and I won't develop this, you'll notice he changes their diet. Now, Daniel couldn't help the change in his dwelling in the land of Babylon. Daniel couldn't help the fact that they're going to teach him the language of the Chaldeans. And Daniel couldn't help his designation, the fact that they'll change his name. There was one thing that Daniel could help, and that was his diet. You might wonder, why was it that this chapter, and why is it in this chapter, that Daniel refuses the king's food? Well, Daniel was aware of certain things. And there's maybe 3 reasons why he refused the king's food. And the first reason is this: Daniel was aware that we become like what we eat. Most of us know that very well. We become what we eat. You think of what we eat, it makes an impact on our physical being. And Daniel was aware what he partook of would make an impact on his physical being. The second thing, it was against the revealed will of God. You think of Leviticus 11, some of those other portions of the Old Testament, where God actually told the Jewish people that they couldn't eat certain things. There was no scruples in Babylon. If you went to the land of Babylon, there was no scruples at all about eating pig or about eating some of those other animals that God told his people that they shouldn't eat about. And so, in Babylon, you can partake of whatever you want. You can enjoy whatever you want. The food of the Babylonian world, it was open for all. It was to be enjoyed by all. And of course, beloved saints, we spiritualize that. The Babylonian world around us. Be careful now, just what we partake of. If Babylon speaks of the world's religion, you think of that challenge to our hearts now. Do we partake of that? The religious world. There's some recordings out there, and some believers have actually told me, oh, you should listen to this. And they mention a certain person, and they say, you should listen to him. And sometimes I do listen to him, and sometimes I'm aware of certain things and certain aspects of theology that belong to a Babylonian world. And so, here, Daniel was aware that there was certain things he couldn't partake of. The third reason, and maybe the most pertinent reason of all, is because this food had been offered to idols. And as the food was presented to the idols, in the idol's temple, the idol would have been worshipped, and the food presented and then partaken of. And Daniel said, no, I won't partake of that food that has been offered to some of the idols in Babylon. I'll partake of vegetables, and I'll partake of those things that haven't been offered to the idols. And so we've got the students in the chapter, and we've got their dwelling, and we've got their diction, and we've got their designation, and we've got their diet in Daniel chapter 1. And Daniel refused. That brings me to this, the steadfastness in the chapter. These men said no to a king. You remember Abraham, Genesis chapter 14. Abraham said no to a king, the king of Sodom. You remember David. I'm thinking now of Saul. David said no to the king, and he refused the king's armor. You remember there's the man Moses in the palace of Pharaoh, and Moses said no to the king. You remember the man Naboth and his vineyard, and Naboth said no to the king. You remember Elijah, and Elijah said no to the king, That's to King Ahab. And you go through the scriptures, and there came a time when these men put their appreciation of God above bowing to the will of the king. You know, beloved saints, it might get like this in our experience. We might have to make the same call, and we might have to say the same thing, and we might have to display the same steadfastness as Daniel displayed, and as Daniel's companions displayed, and they said no to the king. That brings me to the last thing, just in the last few minutes that I have. The situation in the chapter, the society in the chapter, the sovereignty in the chapter, the sanctity in the chapter. We've noticed the students in the chapter, the steadfastness in the chapter. They said no to the king. The last thing I want to speak to you about is the service in the chapter. Daniel, he was going to serve. In fact, at the end of verse number 5, it says, so nourishing them 3 years. And it says, the whole purpose of these 3 years, it was to the end that they might stand before the king. And Daniel, he was aware that he served. But Daniel was aware that he didn't serve Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel was aware that he lived for another world. And Daniel was aware that he lived for another kingdom. And Daniel was aware that he lived for another king. Let me just challenge our hearts, beloved saints. What world are we living for? We're in a very changing world. We're in a very difficult world. We're in a world where we are facing circumstances that we've never faced before. This coronavirus. And who knows how long we're going to be in this situation. Maybe it might only be a few weeks, but I would doubt that. Most likely, we'll be in this situation in a month's time, and maybe in months to come. And maybe we should learn the lesson that Daniel learned. Daniel was aware that even in those circumstances, he still served. And he served another king, and he served another kingdom. You know, God always has his servants. Maybe I'm speaking to a beloved sister tonight, and you're prepared to serve him and live for him. Maybe I'm speaking to an older brother tonight, and you're prepared to serve him and live for him. Maybe I'm speaking to a younger person tonight. Daniel was 16, and he made up his mind he would serve his God, and he would serve his king, and he would serve in another kingdom. You know, beloved saints, God can use any of us to serve in very small ways. I listened this afternoon to a very touching thing. Actually, Elaine showed it to me on social media. There was a dear pastor of a church that was in hospital recently with coronavirus. And as he's laid aside, none of his family members were able to visit him. None of his friends could come. No minister could come. No one was allowed into the unit that he was found in, a critical care unit. No one was allowed in apart from the health workers and some of the hospital workers. And into that unit one night, there came a man, and he was just the cleaner. And he was moving around inside the unit, and he was cleaning, and he was moving about, and he stopped, and he looked at the Christian that was lying in the bed, and the Christian looked up at him, and the hospital staff had been wondering about whether they would ventilate the man, and they were wondering, Lee McClellan is his name, they were wondering if Lee should be put onto ventilation. Such was his problem with his respiratory issues and things like that. And the dear man that's the cleaner, he stops and he takes a look at him, and he started to try and comfort him. And he started to tell him that there was a God. And the man that's the Christian lying in the bed, he looked at the cleaner in the hospital, and he told him that he too was a Christian. And he was a pastor of a church. And he started to pour out his heart to him. And the dear man that was the cleaner told him he'd been in Nigeria, and he served the Lord in Nigeria. Then he'd come home back to Ireland, and now he was working on the hospital staff. Just before he left, he moved to the doorway, and he said to Lee, he said, would you mind if I prayed for you? And Lee said, sure, please pray for me. That man in the doorway of the hospital, the critical care unit, he lifted his heart to the Lord and he started to pray for him. And he besought the Lord that he would heal his body and he would remember him lying in the bed. And then he left him. And he would pass by some of the windows just a few hours later. He would give him the thumbs up. Lee, lying in the bed, looked at the Christian. He gave him the thumbs up back. And it was that night that the man's condition broke. And he found himself getting better. He goes on to tell in the story, I should finish it. He goes on to tell in the story that night when he found himself, his breathing was easing a little bit. He said to himself, is this really possible? That this was the result of that man's prayer for me? Is it possible the Lord has begun to heal my body? He's lying in the bed and he started to think to himself, I wouldn't mind a packet of chips. They call them crisps over there. I wouldn't mind a packet of chips. In fact, he said, Lord, if it's possible, I would love a packet of prawn cocktail chips. Now, we don't have prawn cocktail here. The closest we have is all dressed. And he said, Lord, if it's possible, if someone could bring them to me, he said, I would like a packet of Tato prawn cocktail chips. And that dear cleaner came in the next morning to see him. And he brought a bag with him. And he was only allowed to pass the bag through the doorway. Wasn't allowed to come in himself. And he said to Lee that was lying in the bed, he said, there's something for you there. He said, the Lord put it in my heart to bring you something. And Lee said, he opened the bag. There was 2 oranges. I opened the part. He wanted a packet of chips and he wanted a can of Coke. And there lying in the bed, he opened the bag. There was 2 oranges. There was the packet of prawn cocktail, all dressed chips. And there was a can of Coke. And the man that was healed from coronavirus said, he said there was only a cleaner in the hospital, but the Lord used him. He used him to pray for me, and God has raised me to help. He used him to bring me something when I was in the depth of need. You know, beloved saints, tonight, the Most High, he rules in the kingdoms of man. He was able to use a cleaner in the hospital in Belfast. He's able to use Daniel in the country of Babylon. He's able to use you, and he's able to use me. Difficult circumstances. It's difficult times, but the Most High God still reigns in the kingdoms of man. I trust the Lord will bless his word to our hearts tonight. May he encourage our souls, and that God will remember us as we're moving forward together, that we remember each other and pray for each other, and that the Lord will help us for his own glory.